Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 9 important articles for a comprehensive analysis. We have few topics that require a detailed and thorough explanation and few small topics relevant only for the prelims exam. So let's cover all these articles in complete detail so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. And if you guys are benefiting from our initiative, do support us with your likes and comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Before we start, I have a very important announcement. Those who are preparing for 2026-2027 exams, you have a golden opportunity to enroll for Unacademy IAS English Classroom Program. And Unacademy is providing a flat 55% discount on the subscription. And you can access a 15-month course at just $23,999 and an 18-month course at $25,999. These classes are comprehensive classes which are designed not only to provide you live lectures from our top educators, but it will also provide you the study material, the test series, and as well as mentorship and doubt resolution sessions. So to avail this offer, you need to enter the code IAS English, and the link for subscription is provided in the video description below. And please join my Telegram channel. Scan the QR code given here on the screen, because after the session ends, I'll be sharing the PDF on my Telegram channel. And also do join our official Telegram channel for which the link is provided in the video description below, because after the session, every day we conduct a daily quiz based on these topics which we have covered, so that you can revise these articles again. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at this important article from page number 9. This column is focused on the concept of constitutional morality, a very important topic for Indian polity. This article helps you understand what is the concept of constitutional morality, what is its origin, what are the nuances attached to the concept of constitutional morality, why is it relevant in a constitutional democracy like India. So this topic can easily come as a mains question. UPSC might ask you, what do you mean by the concept of constitutional morality? Explain with relevant examples. So let's understand this in slight detail. If you look at the Supreme Court of India, the constitution benches of the Supreme Court, while interpreting important aspects of the Indian Constitution, they have often employed this concept known as constitutional morality. For example, in the landmark Navtej Singh Johar case of 2018, the Navtej Singh Johar case led to the decriminalization of homosexuality. Then, as well as in the Joseph Shine case of 2018, through which adultery was decriminalized. In these landmark cases, which highlighted the progressive nature of the Indian judiciary, the concept of constitutional morality was employed while passing these critical judgments. So there is a long history of the Indian judiciary, the constitution benches, employing the concept of constitutional morality. Now we can trace this concept to Athenian democracy in Greece. There is the ancient origin behind the concept of constitutional morality. So let's understand what exactly do you mean by constitutional morality. Constitutional morality expects the citizens, the society, to develop a civic culture to respect and almost revere the Constitution and its core features. Because see, at the end of the day, a constitution is just a legal document. Whether it's a written or an unwritten constitution, eventually it's a set of codified rules. Eventually, it's the people who are expected to follow that. People of a certain country, a certain society are expected to uphold those principles, this very spirit through which the constitution was drafted, or else the constitution has no meaning at all. Especially the state which is in power, the government, is expected to treat the constitution with respect, be it the constitution offices, the various forms that arise out of the constitution. If they are not seen with respect, if the constitution is not treated as a sacred document, then eventually you will see that governments will undermine the constitution. They will undermine the very spirit of the ethos of the constitution through which the founding fathers would have envisioned the constitutional structure. And if the society, if the country doesn't have the culture of respecting the constitution, then this will undermine the constitution itself. It will lead to the subversion of the constitution, and that society, that country will no longer be a democracy. So the Greeks very well understood that a constitution is as good as the respect that people will show towards it. When I say people, it means the society, the state. It includes all the stakeholders in a democratic setup. If you do not revere and consider the constitution to be a sacred document, if you don't show that respect towards constitutional officers and hold them in high regard, then the adherence to constitutional norms will slowly deteriorate. So this is something that the ancient Greeks understood very clearly. The birthplace of democracy, the birthplace of constitutional structures. In Athenian democracy, it was very clear that if that civic sense is not built, if the culture of respecting constitution is not promoted, then the constitution will eventually fall apart. Either it will be replaced with another constitution which may not be in line with the spirit and the ethos of the initial constitution, or it might lead to the subversion of the constitutional democratic state and takeover of the state by an authoritarian regime where civic liberties and basic rights could be curbed. So respecting the document, respecting its ethos and following the spirit of the constitution is very important. Almost considering it as a sacred document, revering it is very essential. So this culture has to be built, the values, the principles have to be built in a society. That is what you mean by constitutional morality. At the end of the day, what is morality? Morality is a set of values and principles which helps a society understand what is right, what is not. So when it comes to treating the constitution the right way, respecting and revering the constitution, if that culture is not built, if there are no set values and principles in the society regarding respecting the constitution and the constitutional offices, eventually it will lead to the subversion and the deterioration of the constitution itself. Now, this principle finds an echo in the Indian constitution as well. When the Indian constitution was being drafted, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar invoked the concept of constitutional morality. In 1948, when the draft constitution was taken up for discussion in the Constituent Assembly, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar delivered a historic speech in which he referred to constitutional morality, which was essential to ensure the longevity of the Indian constitution. The founding fathers who are drafting the constitution, they might come out with the best possible legal document. But eventually, few years, few decades later, if the state, the society and the people don't respect the constitution, if they go against the very spirit and the ethos of that constitution, that will lead to the undermining of the constitution itself. So it's important to instill that idea and as well as disperse that idea. Propagate that concept, propagate those values and principles in the society right from a very young age, starting right from schools, so that across the country, in the society, there is a certain reverence towards the constitution, so that the constitution is seen as a sacred document. And this especially applies for the ones who are in power, the elected representatives, your legislators, the government, the executive, the administration needs to see the constitution as a sacred document. Now, there are other nuances attached to this concept as well. Some of you might argue, if we look at constitution as sacred, then does it mean we cannot question the constitution? Does it mean we can't criticize the constitution? Then if we can't criticize the constitution, then what kind of democracy is it? How can we push for constitutional reforms? Maybe certain aspects of a constitution was valid when it was drafted, but few decades later, there might be a need for constitutional changes. So how will that society, that country push towards constitutional reforms without being able to question and criticize the constitution? Now, this is the beauty of a democratic setup. In a democratic setup, though certain aspects of the constitution is seen as sacrosanct, the constitution itself is open for criticism. If you look at the basic rights that are guaranteed, the fundamental rights, that includes right to free speech, the right to criticism, as long as it is constructive, as long as it follows the established process, constitutional morality allows you to criticize the constitution as well and push for constitutional reforms while still treating the overall document as sacred. Now, that is what you see in India by and large. Many constitutional amendments have been done. There has been a push for constitutional reforms. There is a constant debate regarding almost each and every provision of the constitution, but without threatening the very foundation, the very fundamental structure of the constitution, which the Supreme Court later interpreted as the basic structure of the constitution. So, constitutional morality will provide you the right to critique. You can criticize the constitution, debate on it, discuss, but without compromising the original spirit, without destroying the fundamental values and the basic structure. You are free to discuss, debate, and even push for reforms and changes. So, critique is part of constitutional morality. Though you are looking at the document as sacred, it expects reverence, almost like worship, but it is not blind faith. Constitutional morality does not expect blind faith from you. If there is something wrong with the constitution, you can question that, you can critique that, push reforms and changes to the constitution, but by following the established process in the constitution. That is where the genius of the Indian constitution lies. It gives you these basic rights. Dr. Ambedkar, the chairman of the drafting committee, expected the citizens to follow constitutional morality, to respect and worship the constitution, to treat it as a sacred document, to follow the spirit and the ethos of the constitutional principles. But at the same time, it gives you the right to critique the constitution. As long as you follow the process as established under the constitution, you can exercise this basic right to freely express your views, question and criticize the existing constitutional principles, and even push towards changes and reforms. So, the provision of critique is inherent to constitutional morality. Then another important aspect of constitutional morality is self-restraint by those who are in power. The state and those who hold power, essentially the leaders, the politicians, the government, the elected representatives, the executive, they should exercise self-restraint as part of constitutional morality to ensure that the constitution is not undermined by the administration itself. We have seen many such cases come up in India and around the world in democracies. Constitution is like a living document. Though certain changes are necessary, reforms are necessary, sometimes there might be an authoritarian tendency which comes up, as we saw during the emergency period in India. We have seen under various other governments as well, attempts being made to question the very spirit and the basic structure of the constitution. We have seen that happen recently as well under the current dispensation. So such practices should be essentially avoided. Self-restraint has to be shown by those in power, by the state in general, to ensure that the fundamental structure of the constitution is not changed, to ensure that the constitution is not broken with regard to the very core of its basic structure. So constitutional morality expects these basic commitments from the state, from the authority, the administration, and from the society, the people in general. So what does it include? It includes the expectation of reverence towards the constitution, where you look at constitution as a sacred document, so that you respect the constitutional principles, you follow them, and you respect the constitutional offices. Second, it gives you the right to critique. You can criticize the constitution, even push for reforms, exercise your basic right to free speech and expression, but by following the established process without threatening the spirit and the ethos of the original constitution. And third, self-restraint. especially by the administration, those who are in power, the authority, should exercise self-restraint from destroying the foundational principles of the Constitution. So these are certain values and principles which codify constitutional morality. So if, let's say, UPSC gives you a mains question on this topic, I think now you should be able to easily bring out and explain this topic. Let's say the question is asking you to examine this concept of constitutional morality and its relevance. So what you can do, you can start the introduction by setting the context. Maybe you can talk about the ancient origin of constitutional morality. So that is one approach you can take. You can talk about Athenian democracy, how the Greeks understood that a constitution is viable and good only when the people respect that, only when the state and the society respects and reveres the constitution. So those values and principles were ingrained in the Greek democracy. So you can start out with that. Or another approach would be to look at the application of constitutional morality in the Indian context. How India's judiciary, the Supreme Court, has employed the principle of constitutional morality in important cases like Navtej Singh Johar case, the Joseph Shine case. So you can bring that out, and that can also be a good introduction. Then in the body, explain the idea of constitutional morality. Break down the nuances surrounding it. So you need to explain that. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar as well, right, address the Constituent Assembly, expecting a certain reverence towards the Constitution. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was very mindful that in the coming days, Constitution may not be protected all the time if the state and the society doesn't revere and treat this as a sacred document. Dr. Ambedkar insisted that these values have to be instilled in the society. It has to be propagated. It has to be dispersed. So please talk about that aspect of constitutional morality, where Constitution is to be seen as a sacred document with reverence. But this does not mean blind faith. Then you can explain that reverence under constitutional morality doesn't expect blind faith from you. You can critique the Constitution by following the established process. Then exercising self-restraint. The state, the society is expected to exercise self-restraint from changing the fundamental nature of the Constitution itself. So this will essentially build your answer, and the structure would be absolutely perfect for this given question. Then try to conclude by highlighting why constitutional morality is necessary to protect and uphold the original spirit of the Constitution. So this can be a good answer. So let's see if you guys can write the answer and post your answers in the comment section. Now let's move on to the next article. On page 6, we have another interesting column related to what's happening in Georgia. Have you heard of Georgia? A very small Eurasian country sandwiched between Europe and Asia. It has a strategic location in the Eurasia region as it lies at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Now, Georgia has seen recent political turmoil, and whatever has happened in the country is linked to a global power conflict involving the global powers. Recently, Georgia went through elections where apparently a pro-Russian regime has managed to win the election both for the parliament and for the office of the president. There have been strong allegations that Moscow interfered in the election process. It tried to manipulate the electoral process to ensure that pro-Russian parties and candidates can capture the parliament and the office of the president. This allegation led to large-scale protests by the people. The former president, they all stepped out on the street protesting against the alleged Russian interference. And there were reports that Western countries led by United States and European powers were backing these protesters, supporting them to challenge the elections that had taken place. So this political turmoil that you saw in Georgia recently, in a strategically vital country, was not just a domestic internal development. There was a clear external angle to it. There was a clear external role and external interference in the domestic politics of Georgia. Now, this is nothing new. across the world, we have seen many such incidents in the past as well, particularly during the Cold War period. During the Cold War, when US and Soviet Union were ideologically opposed to each other and they were engaged in a geopolitical rivalry, it was quite common practice for both of them to push for regime changes in other countries in order to build their influence and protect their interests. For example, Soviet Union, through its intelligence agency, the KGB, would constantly interfere in the Americas, in South America, Central America, pushing communism and socialism to undermine democracy and to undermine Western interests. So if you look at countries like Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, or Central American countries like Nicaragua, El Salvador, etc., across the region, Soviet influence would push communism, and it led to the popularity of left-wing ideology in order to undermine Western influence and Western values. And Western countries were no less, especially United States. Through its intelligence agency, the CIA, it would push for regime changes around the world, particularly in those areas where Soviet influence was predominant. In Africa, in Asia, in Central Asia, in South Asia, in Eastern Europe. The US would undermine Soviet influence by pushing for regime changes, by sponsoring even violent movements and rebellions. Sometimes even sponsoring dictatorships and authoritarian regimes in order to undercut the influence of the other side. Now, this practice of instilling one's values or sponsoring these revolutions, it has continued post-Cold War as well. For example, in 2003, 2004, 2005, we saw a series of color revolutions, which was mainly sponsored by the West, by United States, in order to undercut Russian influence. In 2003, again in Georgia, there was a similar revolution which is referred to as the Rose Revolution. So what we saw recently in 2024 is the second edition of Rose Revolution, where peaceful protests and revolution is sponsored by the outside. In 2003 in Georgia, which until then was clearly under Russian influence post the end of the Cold War, we saw Western interference where United States was directly involved in supporting the protests in Georgia, the peaceful protests, to undercut Russian influence and promote American Western social, political and economic influence. This led to a change in regime in Georgia in 2003, and it's popularly referred to as the Rose Revolution of 2003. So what we saw last year is essentially the second edition of Rose Revolution, which still continues. Even now, this divide in Georgia continues between the Western-backed protesters and the pro-Russian regime, which has won the election. In 2004, we saw a similar color revolution in Ukraine, known as the Orange Revolution. Ukraine, which was a close Russian ally, as it was a key constituent in the Soviet Republic, it saw the rise of pro-democracy protests sponsored by US and European powers in order to undermine Russian influence. In fact, the current Ukraine conflict traces its origin to the Orange Revolution that pitted US against Russia and Western powers against Russia in Ukraine. Then in 2005, in Kyrgyzstan, the Central Asian country, which was also a former Soviet republic, we saw the Tulip Revolution. So these are often referred to as the color revolutions, which seek to push democracy and so-called Western values, Western influence, by promoting peaceful revolutions, peaceful protests, in order to undercut Russian influence. So there is a long history of such movements happening around the world, across especially the Eurasia region. In order to undercut Russian influence post the end of the Cold War, Western powers led by US have often pushed for such regime changes. They even try to project this as a soft power initiative. though it involves intelligence agencies and covert warfare. It's often promoted as a soft power initiative because the idea is to promote largely peaceful revolutions, to promote democratic peaceful protests, to instill Western democratic values. But experience and history shows us that these revolutions never really instilled true democracy in these countries. These Western experiments, they all failed because eventually we saw the rise of authoritarianism and corrupt regimes in these countries which were sponsored by the Western powers. The US would even justify the color revolutions and its sponsorship by pointing out that it was a soft power initiative looking to promote civilized values, looking to instill democratic principles. But eventually the regimes they installed, the regimes they promoted, would turn out to be corrupt authoritarian regimes. So be it pro-Russian regimes or pro-Western regimes, there has been absolutely no difference between them. It's not as if the Western-backed regimes and governments are better than the pro-Russian regimes. Though US justifies this by stating that pro-Russian regimes are autocratic, they are crushing human rights, and they justify the sponsorship of these soft power initiatives to trigger a color revolution by pointing out that this will lead to reforms and it will bring progressiveness, it will bring modern values. Eventually, even these Western sponsored revolutions will lead to corrupt authoritarian regimes itself. So people in these countries have been disillusioned over the decades. Despite repeated regime changes which might be sponsored by either one external power or the other, eventually the people of these countries don't see any real change. So what you're seeing today in Georgia and also in some other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, is an extension of this rivalry, the Cold War era rivalry that persisted between then Soviet Union and the Western powers. So this has continued even today between Russia and United States on the other side. So that is what we take away from this important article, which can be relevant for international relations. Now, if you ask me, why do countries interfere in the domestic politics of another country? It's mainly to push their interests, to protect their interests, and especially in strategic countries like Georgia, which occupy a key location, to undercut the influence of their rivals. So the American interest here in Georgia to sponsor the new edition of Rose Revolution is basically to undercut Russian influence, because Russia has manipulated the elections according to allegations. Russia has managed to install a pro-Russian regime. So naturally, the Western governments led by US and Europe will sponsor the protesters, the people, to carry out this movement, a revolutionary movement. Even though largely peaceful, it is still a revolutionary movement aimed at toppling the regime and aimed at installing a pro-Western regime. So that is what we learn from this important article regarding the developments in geopolitics. So please take up this practice question. Examine whether soft power strategies such as promoting democracy through color revolutions are still effective with relevant examples. Examples clearly show that such strategies have never been effective. It has never really brought in true democracy. Even the Western sponsored regimes have turned corrupt and autocratic eventually. There are many examples we have seen of this. So based on what we have discussed, please try to write a good answer for this question. Now let's look at an important editorial on page number 6 related to the tragedies connected with the Kumbh Mela. The Kumbh Mela, the Mahakumbh, which comes once in 144 years, is being celebrated in Prayagraj as a mega Hindu pilgrimage event. Organizing this event is no easy task. It's not a joke when millions and millions of people are expected. According to the government, 400 million pilgrims were expected throughout the course of the Mahakumbh Mela. Obviously, creating facilities for such a large crowd, managing them, providing the facilities and amenities for them, and ensuring that no adverse incident happens is not an easy task. It is a logistical nightmare. But the government had bragged about its own achievements. Both the UP government and the center had taken up a lot of measures, including appropriate security measures, providing the right facilities, setting up an entire temporary town and a city, setting up the camp town, along with crowd management tools by bringing technology such as AI-based surveillance cameras, drones, additional police and security forces. So a lot of planning, lot of preparation went into the efforts to organize the event. Massive amounts of money was also spent. Almost 7,500 crores is the overall budget to organize the Mahakumbh Mela. Despite all these efforts and measures, we have seen deadly tragedies occurring one after the other. A few weeks ago, we saw the deadly stampede during a important religious event as part of the Mahakumbh Mela, where many people lost their lives in Prayagraj. We discussed the stampede incident as well from a disaster management perspective in one of our previous sessions. I hope you guys remember that. On the back of this tragedy, we have seen another tragic incident a couple of days ago in New Delhi. At the New Delhi railway station, pilgrims who were headed towards Prayagraj, who were looking to board these special trains that the government had been running to facilitate connectivity to Prayagraj. Due to the massive rush and the poor crowd management by Indian Railways, a tragedy unfolded where many people suffocated, got crushed and lost their lives in New Delhi as well. Now, these repeat incidents are a clear reminder that sufficient preparation and planning has not been done by the authorities. See, no wonder, there's no doubt about this, that organizing such a mega event is not an easy task. I know it's easy to blame the government, but eventually the blame does lie at the doorstep of the administration. They might have spent enough money, they might have taken a lot of measures as they claim, but eventually if tragedies are occurring, people are losing their lives, the responsibility falls at the doorstep of the administration, the state government and the central government and the concerned stakeholders. Now, if you see what happened in New Delhi at the railway station, it was largely avoidable. In one of the previous sessions, when I explained what is a stampede, why does a stampede occur, we discussed how a crowd functions like one organism. A large crowd of people, they tend to move in one direction, and how the crowd is going to be managed will entirely determine whether the crowd will be safe or will it lead to a stampede situation where even injuries and deaths can occur. If the routes, the queues and barricades are not well planned, when you're managing a large crowd, obviously there will be certain defined routes through which you are expecting the crowd to move through. There will be queues that will be set up, barricades will be created, a lot of structural measures will also be implemented to manage and contain the crowd to ensure the orderly movement of people. At the end of the day, what you need is orderly movement so that people don't stumble upon each other, they don't fall on each other and crush the other people. So to ensure orderly movement, these facilities, these arrangements should have been created through prior planning and preparedness. But if adequate precautions are not taken and if these measures are not adequate and sufficient, that is when a stampede-like situation arises. Generally, a crowd is driven by the crowd mentality, right? We spoke about the psychological aspect, how individual humans are driven by their own self-interest. They put their own self-interest above the interest of the crowd. So when there is a threat which might emerge in the crowded area, or a rumor that spreads which might trigger panic, or if there is miscommunication which leads to a panic-like situation, it results in the crowd moving in one uniform direction, leading to disorderly movement of the crowd. That is when many people get crushed by the other people, especially those who are trapped in between. They suffocate, they die from asphyxia, or they will suffer injuries, serious injuries to their respiratory tract, lungs, their rib cage could get crushed, or internal organs might get injured, leading to the death of the people. So to prevent this from happening, what you need is adequate planning to ensure that the crowd moves in an orderly manner, ensure that there is right communication. Even if there is a disruption or a panic-like situation, there should be immediate intervention. So you need to monitor the crowd in real time, constantly. And if there is a sudden disorderly movement, authorities have to step in and manage the crowd and ensure they move in a proper manner. The exits have to be well planned. The entry-exit points should not be bottlenecks. It should not create a bottleneck. So what you saw in New Delhi at the railway station was an absolute failure of planning and preparedness by the Indian Railways. Because reports are indicating that what happened was largely miscommunication. Thousands of people had assembled as thousands of tickets had been issued because there was a very high demand for pilgrims to go to Prayagraj. though the government was running special trains, on the day of that event, the tragedy that happened, almost 2,600 tickets were issued by Indian Railways, which means Indian Railways was aware that the crowd was expected. So they could have managed the crowd better with better planning, given that the high number of tickets that had been issued. And after the crowd assembled at the railway platform, there was a wrong communication that the train is arriving at a different platform. So this led to sudden panic amongst the crowd. Everybody wanted a seat. Everybody wanted to get into this train. They didn't care about the crowd and the safety of the crowd. They cared about their own self-interest. They started moving in these disorderly manner, which eventually led to the crushing of people, and many people lost their lives. So if the railways had ensured that the train arrives at the right platform, if the communication was properly managed, such panic would have not been created and the crowd would have remained where it was. So the editorial is basically telling us that through better planning and preparedness, authorities can prevent these tragedies from occurring. The government can't simply dismiss its responsibility here. Just because it's a religious event and the government has done enough, the government can't say that we have taken care of everything, but still these tragedies are occurring, and it can't try to shift the responsibility. The editorial is very clear that the responsibility lies with the government, because politically as well, there has been a lot of push for the event. Even on social media, if you look at the hype that has been created, right? The intent to attract larger crowds could have a political motive. Of course, it might bring political dividends for parties, but that can't come at the cost of human lives. The editorial makes a very appropriate point that just for the sake of political appreciation from the voters, you can't risk human lives, and eventually when tragedies occur, you can't shift the responsibility. The government has to own for the tragedy that has occurred, ensure such tragedies are prevented, because stampedes are preventable disasters. So that is what we take away from this editorial. Next, we have another important column on page 6. In this column, the writer is talking about emissions from our thermal power plants. The emissions from thermal power plants, and how few states in the country are facing a higher burden of pollution because of thermal power generation, whereas other states are largely escaping the higher emission intensity and pollution because they are mainly consumers of thermal power. Now, if you look at India's electricity generation, there are some important facts and patterns that you should be able to understand. Now, if you look at India's energy basket, where is our energy coming from? Majority of the energy that we consume, primarily electricity, it's coming from fossil fuel based sources. Especially thermal power plants account for majority of the source for electricity production. Thermal plants are mainly coal powered plants. Then oil gas based electricity generation is also present. So fossil fuels account for majority of the electricity that is produced in our country. There are gas powered electricity plants, right? So, but majority of the power generated is through thermal power, which is essentially coal based power plants. Almost 59 to 60% of the power generated in our country is coming through coal based thermal power plants, with other fossil fuel sources as well, including natural gas. Renewable energy is still a small share. It is picking up. Solar, wind, hydropower and other forms of clean renewable energy. The share is increasing, but still it is a smaller share compared to the share of fossil fuel based electricity production. And thermal power generated from coal has the highest percentage in the energy basket of India. Almost 59 to 60% of electricity produced is coming from coal based thermal power plants. So obviously these fossil fuel based power plants will contribute to significant emissions, which not only causes air pollution but contributes to global warming and climate change as well. Now, please don't forget, under the Paris Agreement to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, India has declared its voluntary contributions, the nationally determined contributions. And one of the nationally determined contribution is to bring down our carbon emissions intensity by 45% by the end of the decade as compared to 2005 levels. Now, this is a very ambitious target that the government has set for itself, to bring down carbon emissions intensity by 45% by 2030 as compared to 2005 levels. There is also another ambitious target announced by India to ensure that we have an installed renewable energy capacity of 500 gigawatts and ensure 50% of our electricity is coming from renewable sources. See, right now almost 59-60% of energy is coming from fossil fuel based sources, mainly from thermal power plants, coal based power plants. The goal is to ensure at least 50% of electricity comes from renewable sources. This is one of the targets that India has taken up under Paris Agreement. Now, we will never achieve the target if some states are the primary producers of thermal power. Because there are some states which are just consuming thermal power by buying the thermal power from other states, whereas few states are having the higher burden because of the abundance of coal that is present in those states. Since coal is the feedstock, the primary raw material, in those states where coal is easily available, more thermal plants are located. Now, take for example states such as Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha. In these states, most of the thermal power plants, especially the thermal plants run by the central government, they are located in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh and Odisha. Now, the electricity they are producing by burning coal is not entirely consumed by them. They are exporting it to other states where there is a higher demand. If you look at the energy production capacity in our country, there's a very interesting pattern here. If you look at non-renewable energy capacity, non-renewable sources of energy, if you take that into account and take the capacity of states to produce non-renewable sources of energy, Maharashtra is at the top, followed by UP and Gujarat, which means they have the highest installed capacity when it comes to non-renewable energy sources, but they are also large consumers. So what they are producing within their state is not enough to meet their demand. States like Maharashtra, Gujarat are highly industrialized. They have a higher demand for electricity. So their domestic production is not sufficient. They have to buy electricity from others. States like UP, purely because of its population size and the demand from agriculture and industrial activities, increases the demand for electricity, and UP is not able to meet the demand through domestic production. So UP also becomes a consumer, net consumer, as it imports electricity from other states. Now, which are the states generating this electricity, which is being bought by these large and industrial states? It's primarily Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh and Odisha, which are considered to be relatively backward. The thermal power generated here, which causes pollution in these states, leading to emissions in these states, is being sold to the other states. Now, the argument of the writers is that this is unfair to the states producing thermal power, because they are taking the burden of pollution and emissions, whereas others are simply buying clean electricity from them. For them, it doesn't cause any pollution. And also, please understand, for electricity production in our country, there are no taxes. It is tax exempt. I hope you know that. Electricity production is tax exempt. Even GST doesn't apply. Electricity sale will have tax component which generates revenue for the government, but electricity production has no taxes. It is exempt from GST as well, which means producing states will not get any revenue. Producing states will not get any additional revenue for all the electricity being generated in their state. But where it is being sold and consumed eventually, here taxes and GST will be levied for the consumer eventually, right? And this generates revenue for the states which are buying cleaner electricity. Though it's coming from fossil fuels, for those who are buying it, it is clean for them. It's not causing any pollution or emissions in their state. Now, let's say, for example, Maharashtra is buying large amount of electricity from, let's say, Jharkhand, right? Now, for that quantum of electricity that Maharashtra imported from Jharkhand, Maharashtra did not face any pollution or emissions. Basically, for Maharashtra, it is clean electricity. and it is generating revenue as well by levying taxes on the power sales. But for Jharkhand, which produced that electricity by using coal, it caused significant pollution and emissions. The people of Jharkhand will pay the price, and the state is not even getting revenue for it because electricity production is tax exempt and GST excluded. That is why the writers are calling for a compensation mechanism to be created. A compensation mechanism so that those states which are buying fossil fuel based electricity, they should pay a certain compensation to the states producing it. So this can be done either through an innovative taxation system, where maybe the central government can work out a tax formula so that electricity producing states will benefit from it, because revenue will be needed to combat the impact of pollution and emissions. The revenue for these electricity producing states, right, is necessary because they need the money for tackling the pollution, tackling the impact of emissions on human health, to clean the environment, to focus on cleaner technologies to reduce the overall emissions. So some sort of mechanism can be worked out, maybe through the Finance Commission. In fact, previous finance commissions have taken this up. They have considered the possibility of environment-based horizontal devolution. Those states at a disadvantage should get more funds based on environmental grounds. This is a formula which even Finance Commission has considered. Maybe if the center goes ahead, the 16th Finance Commission can consider this and ensure that there is an incentive created for electricity producing states, which will basically be paid from the electricity consuming states. So that is the core argument being made in this article. That is what you need to understand. There are few states which are taking a higher burden of pollution and emissions because most of the coal plants are present in those states. The thermal power plants are present in few states. There are others who are consuming it. Basically, they are getting clean electricity without facing the impact of pollution and emissions. So either those states have to pay and give a compensation to the producing states, or center has to work out a new horizontal devolution formula through Finance Commission so that the electricity producing states are incentivized so that they can use the higher funds given for environmental purposes to tackle pollution and emissions. So that's a very interesting take on the issue being faced by some states which are mainly electricity producing states. Now let's look at the prelim section and let's quickly go through these small articles before we wind up today's session. On page number 8, we have an article related to the proposed Aravali Safari Park. You might have heard that the government of Haryana has proposed a mega project. The Haryana government has proposed a massive safari park that will stretch to 3,800 hectares, and it is projected as the world's largest safari park. It is projected to come up in Gurugram and the Nuh district of Haryana, where the Haryana government is looking to take over 3,800 hectares of forest land spread across Gurugram and Nuh district to create this world's largest safari park. This safari park is primarily meant to promote tourism. In the safari park, animals would be kept in cages like a zoo, like a zoological park. Lot of facilities will be created for tourists, from hotels and resorts to restaurants and amenities and various fun activities, recreational centers, amusement parks will be set up so that tourists can be attracted both from India and abroad. So it's primarily a tourism initiative. Don't think it's an environment related, conservation related project. It's not. Just because it's called Safari Park, please understand it's not a national park. It's not a wildlife sanctuary which is being created. It's not a protected area. If it's an environmental initiative, a conservation focused initiative, the government would have set up a national park or a wildlife sanctuary, which are protected areas, which have legal protection under the Wildlife Protection Act. But here what the government is seeking to set up is a tourism initiative to create a safari park where animals are held in cages, large scale facilities are created for tourists to bring revenue for the government and to drive economic activities. On one hand, the initiative is definitely appreciable as it can drive tourism, bring economic activities to the region. But however, look at the downside. Please understand that Aravali's is a very sensitive ecology. The Aravali mountain range, I hope you know, is the world's oldest fold mountain structure. The Aravalis are the oldest fold mountain range in the world. It's a rich geological site with a very important biodiversity. There are a number of important species of flora and fauna that inhabit this ecosystem. The mountain range that stretches from Gujarat to Delhi via Rajasthan and Haryana, it's a critical ecosystem. This mountain range stretches to up to 690 kilometers from the Champaner region in Gujarat in a southwest to northeast direction towards Delhi, ending at Raisina Hill, the national capital. The Aravali mountain ranges are not only home to a rich biodiversity of wildlife species of flora and fauna, but it also plays a very important role. For example, Aravali mountains and the whole range is critical in arresting desertification. The spread of the Thar desert towards eastern Rajasthan is arrested by the Aravali ranges. I hope you know that. The Aravali mountain ranges and the whole ecosystem acts as an aquifer that facilitates percolation of water to the ground table, leading to the recharge of groundwater. So these are important ecological functions performed by the Aravali ranges. Please make a note. This can come as a prelims question. It's the world's oldest fold mountain range, stretching from Gujarat to Delhi in a southwest-northeast direction, and it plays a critical role in arresting desertification and the spread of Thar desert into eastern Rajasthan. It acts as an aquifer, promoting the recharge of the groundwater table, and it is home to hundreds and hundreds of important species of flora and fauna. In such a critical habitat, the state government has proposed a safari park, mainly with tourism as a primary initiative, as a primary purpose. That is why many former Indian Forest Service officers, almost 37 IFOS officers, have written to the central government to not allow this project to be taken up, because this could destroy the sensitive ecology of the Aravalis. If it was a national park or a wildlife sanctuary set up as a protected area under Wildlife Protection Act, then it would have been a welcome step. But a safari park with pure intention of driving tourism will only lead to large-scale construction, traffic, pollution, and significant damage to the ecosystem. Hence, there is strong opposition against this proposed project from environmental activists and as well as from former retired Indian Forest Service officers. They've already written to Prime Minister Modi to bring pressure on the state government and to not allow this project to be set up. So that is why Aravali Safari Park is in the news. Next, the Chief Election Commissioner has been appointed. Gyanesh Kumar, who was serving as an election commissioner to the Election Commission of India, has now been elevated as the Chief Election Commissioner. He is all set to assume office in a couple of days. So the appointment process of the election commissioners and Chief Election Commissioner becomes important. We covered this recently. I would just like to reiterate this again for those who didn't attend the class, because this is again a very important topic for prelims. Until 2023, appointment of election commissioners and Chief Election Commissioner was entirely the discretion of the government. The Council of Ministers would recommend the name to the President. The President would appoint those individuals as election commissioners and Chief Election Commissioner. But in 2023, the Supreme Court intervened, given that Election Commission is a critical body to hold free and fair elections. If the appointment is entirely determined by the government, then you can't expect fairness. A lot of questions had come up regarding the integrity of the election commissioners. The Supreme Court intervened in 2023, providing for a selection committee. A committee that would be headed by the Prime Minister of India, including the leader of opposition in the Lok Sabha and the Chief Justice of India. Basically, the judiciary gave a role for itself in the appointment process of election commissioners and Chief Election Commissioner. These three members of the committee would meet under the chairmanship of the PM with leader of opposition from Lok Sabha and the Chief Justice of India to select the election commissioners and Chief Election Commissioner. But this was seen as interference from the judiciary. The government resisted this change. It was seen as a case of judicial activism and judicial overreach. So immediately the government pushed a bill in the parliament and enacted a new law. The Chief Election Commissioner and Election Commissioners Appointment Act was passed with the parliament in 2023, making one change to this election committee. Along with Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition of the Lok Sabha, this act replaced the Chief Justice of India with a Union Minister to be appointed by the Prime Minister. Now, these are the members of the selection committee, clearly giving majority to the government in power, right? So, Prime Minister and the Union Minister clearly have a majority. Leader of Opposition becomes just a nominal member of this committee. So, there has been a lot of criticism regarding this act, as the government has again essentially ensured that it has complete control over the appointment process. It has even led to petitions being filed at the Supreme Court asking for a review of this law, calling it unconstitutional. So this committee, consisting of Prime Minister Modi, Union Home Minister Amit Shah and Leader of Opposition Rahul Gandhi, they have met, and despite few objections raised by the Leader of Opposition, since government has full majority in this committee, the Prime Minister and the Home Minister have gone ahead with the elevation of Election Commissioner Gyanesh Kumar as the next Chief Election Commissioner of India. The President has appointed the new Chief Election Commissioner, who would be assuming office very soon. Next, on page 1, we have an article related to deposit insurance. What is deposit insurance? See, all of us deposit our money in banks, correct? Putting our faith and trust in the banks, in the banking system, hoping that our money is safe. But what if eventually the bank itself collapses? What if there is a fraud in the bank where depositors' money has been misused? Or what if the bank has been mismanaged and its non-performing assets have increased, leading to liquidity crisis in the bank, which causes the collapse of the bank itself? We have seen many such developments happening. So depositors will be at risk of losing their money. So to safeguard the interest of the depositors, the government came out with the deposit insurance concept, which is seen world over. In 1961, the Deposit Insurance and Credit Guarantee Act was passed by the Parliament to provide an insurance, to set up an insurance facility so that depositors will get at least some part of their deposit. Even if the bank collapses, at least some small part of that deposit can be obtained by the depositors. This is managed by the Deposit Insurance and Credit Guarantee Corporation, which was established in 1968 under the Ministry of Finance. Under the Finance Ministry, there is a corporation set up for this purpose to manage the deposit insurance scheme. So there is a law that provides legal mandate for deposit insurance and credit guarantee, and the dispersal of deposit insurance and maintenance of these funds is the responsibility of this corporation set up in 1968 under the Finance Ministry. In 1993, the insurance limit was capped at 1 lakh rupees. Following the economic reforms, as more money started flowing into the banking system, insurance limit, the deposit insurance limit was hiked to 1 lakh rupees. That irrespective of how much you have deposited, the maximum insurance relief you can get in case of the collapse of the bank would be 1 lakh rupees. Or if you have deposited only, let's say 50-60,000 rupees, you will get only 50-60,000. But those who have deposited more than 1 lakh, they will just get an insurance of 1 lakh rupees. That is the maximum limit. This limit was recently revised following the collapse of multiple banks, especially in the cooperative sector. There were many cases of fraudulent activity, rising non-performing assets, which led to the fall of the Punjab and the Maharashtra cooperative banks. In Karnataka and in Jharkhand as well, many small banks failed, where depositors basically lost their deposits. Following these incidents in 2020, this limit was hiked to 5 lakh rupees. In a very big change, in 2020, the government hiked the deposit insurance limit to 5 lakh rupees. That is, you will get an insurance up to a maximum of 5 lakhs depending on how much you have deposited. Now there is a report that Finance Ministry is considering to hike the deposit insurance limit again. Very shortly, the center is expected to increase the deposit insurance limit, which is good news for depositors. This will basically give you more guarantee regarding your deposits. In case the bank fails, you will get a higher amount as insurance. Next, on page 10 and 11, there are articles related to Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, and both are connected to Adani Power. I'm sure you are aware that Adani Group has been facing a lot of controversies of late, from corruption charges being filed in the US to allegations of corruption within India, especially the involvement of Adani Group in many foreign projects which are strategically important for India. There have been allegations that the Indian government has been pressurizing foreign governments like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and others to award key projects to Adani Group. Though India denies all these accusations, there are serious concerns surrounding some of the Adani projects in other countries. Now, in Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh, we studied this recently as well. We spoke about the Adani wind power project in Sri Lanka. In both countries, the controversy is basically the same. See, Bangladesh is buying electricity from Adani Power. Adani Power has a thermal plant in India, in Jharkhand again, which is exporting electricity to Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh has complained that the tariffs are higher. Basically, the price charged by Adani Group is very high, and Bangladesh has called into question the deal between India and Bangladesh. The deal was struck when Sheikh Hasina was in power, and now that there is a new interim government after Sheikh Hasina's regime was thrown out, the interim government has questioned the deal and it is looking to renegotiate the prices. It's even looking to stall the project itself if necessary. Then similarly in Sri Lanka, in the Mannar region, renewable energy projects including wind projects were awarded to Adani Group. But in Sri Lanka, there has been a controversy surrounding these projects, that Sri Lanka was forced to award these projects to India as India pressurized Sri Lanka. When India gave economic assistance during the crisis, it's been alleged that India forced Sri Lanka to award the project to Adani Group. Also locally, there have been protests in the Mannar region on environmental grounds and social grounds as well. Plus, the Sri Lankan government has now alleged, the new leadership in Sri Lanka has alleged that the prices quoted by Adani Power for this wind power project is very high, which means Sri Lanka will pay the price, the higher price, which is against Sri Lankan interests. So in Sri Lanka as well, the project is being reviewed, and recently Adani Power announced that it is quitting the project in Sri Lanka. So you just need to be aware of this development, the controversy surrounding Adani Group, how Adani projects in other countries are facing challenges on grounds of environmental rights, social rights, and as well as higher prices and unfavorable deals being worked out, allegedly at the pressure of the Indian government. See, we don't know whether it's true or not, and it's not our job to evaluate whether these accusations are true or not. But just to understand the crisis, how it can affect our foreign policy interests, how it can affect our projects and investments in other countries is something I think is relevant and important. Coming to the last article, in the supplementary page, we have a science and tech article related to the nuclear sector. See, in Europe, there is a mega project coming up called ITER, International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. It's one of the biggest, most important scientific projects which is underway. It is set up at a place called Cadarache in France. It is primarily led by the European Union, and it is backed by 6 major global powers, including India, China, South Korea and Japan, and even US and Russia. It's one of those rare collaborations where different countries, which might have rivalries between them, but still they have come together to fund and support this critical project, the ITER project. How come it is so important? How come these different countries like India, China are rivals, US, Russia are rivals, but still they're coming together as part of this project? How and why? That's because ITER is focused on nuclear fusion, something which we still have not mastered. See, right now, all the nuclear energy production in nuclear power plants, it is based on nuclear fission, where an atom of uranium is split to create a self-sustaining reaction, a cyclical reaction that generates electricity. It's primarily nuclear fission, which is employed in our nuclear weapons as well. But nuclear fusion is much more superior, and it can solve the energy problem of the world. Nuclear fission, on one hand, generates harmful radiation. So it's a huge health and environmental hazard, and the power generated through fission is quite limited. Now, if you look at the stars, including our sun, the primary reaction that generates the energy is nuclear fusion. That is what we humans are trying to pioneer and master. ITER is this experimental tomahawk reactor, which is seeking to control nuclear fusion. Is that clear? Now, in nuclear fusion, where atoms are fused instead of being split, in fission atoms are split, whereas in fusion the atoms are fused together to generate energy. It's very, very hard to control the reaction and maintain the plasma that is generated at such tremendously high temperatures. The temperature can reach 100 million degrees Celsius. It's almost like creating a mini sun or a mini star on Earth. So ITER has not faced much progress. It has faced a lot of delays. There's a lot of criticism against the project as it has been very expensive. Though researchers have recently shown some limited progress where they sustained a fusion reaction for a fraction of a second. But there is a parallel sister project in China called the East Reactor project. China is pursuing a related sister project called the East project, experimental advanced superconducting tokamak reactor. This critical reactor called the East reactor, the experimental advanced superconducting tokamak reactor in China, it has achieved something remarkable recently. You might have read few articles claiming that China has developed a mini sun. They were referring to this experiment. Chinese researchers have claimed that using the East tokamak reactor, which is related to the ITER project, which can enable the ITER initiative, Chinese researchers have claimed that they could sustain the plasma created through nuclear fusion at 100 million degrees Celsius temperature. That too for almost 1000 plus seconds, which makes it a remarkable scientific outcome. So this could pave the way for a self-sustaining nuclear fusion cycle. It could pave the way for the first ever nuclear fusion reactor, the ITER. If we can pioneer and master the nuclear fusion technology and employ that for power generation at ITER in France, then this will not only provide us with clean power source, it could also solve the energy problem, as the raw material is easily available in sufficient quantity to make it a never-ending source of power and a clean source of power without the risk of nuclear radiation, the harmful nuclear radiation that comes out of nuclear fission. So please be aware of the East reactor in China, how it is related to the ITER project. So on this note, I bring my discussion to an end. I hope it's been a useful and interesting analysis. Now please go back, revise these articles, join our official Telegram channel so that you can take up the daily quiz and attempt some MCQs to practice the questions as well. So if you guys understood everything, like the session, do press the like button, do share your comments below, and don't forget to share these videos with other aspirants. That is it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Have a good day.